Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today is going to be the first in a series of episodes about Narcissistic Personality Disorder and narcissism in general. We're going to break this into a few episodes because I did do a single sitting shoot of this, and it ended up being an hour long. And maybe I'll post that at some point for those who want to see the original recording as well as seeing it in one fell swoop. But I thought it wise, just because it's such a dense construct, to break this apart between episodes. And so the breakdown will look like this. Today, in this episode, what we're going to be focusing on is key elements. This is going to include diagnostic features, including in the Diagnostic Manual. So I'm going to I'm pointing down because I've got it in front of me. Actually go through the symptoms, but talk about it and hopefully bring them to life a little bit. But then also look at psychodynamic theory and what it tells us about narcissism. Again, hopefully adding this color shading in depth rather than just reading stuff off. In future episodes, what we'll go into first and foremost is the development of narcissistic personality disorder, but also narcissism in general. I'm a big proponent that most personality-related issues have a normal range of functioning. They live inside of us all to varying degrees, and so I'll talk about normal range development around narcissism. And then that more pathological development, including psychodynamic theories of a continuum-based understanding, or there being multiple organization levels around narcissism. And what does that look like? Underneath that will be subtypes. So what are some potential subtypes of narcissism? I'm always a little bit careful about that because for many people, they just treat it as a new category to toss people into. But hopefully it adds that color and shading depth that is going to permeate all of these episodes. Then I've been wishy-washy about treatment. One, I'm not here to dispense clinical advice. I'm not here to guide people on how precisely to treat. That would have to be a formal training. This is more talking about aspects of treatment to consider, which I also think helps conceptualize these individuals a little bit. So we'll kind of float into that. And then the last one I hope is of particular interest to folks, and that's sociocultural intersections. Like, how does narcissism present and interface with society at large? It's an important construct. And the two ones that I am hoping to go into is one, gender. Gender is a really interesting subcomponent of narcissism because it is a gendered construct. And so we'll talk about that both historically, but then also apply it to the evolution of society in the present day. Is it shaping narcissism at all in the present day? The second one being narcissism and power/authority. What is our responsibility as a society, not to be able to diagnose this, but be able to recognize narcissistic concerns, narcissistic defenses, particularly when it comes to gatekeeping in positions or gatekeeping for positions of power and authority. So that's going to be the breakdown. It's more than likely going to be, I'm guessing, 3 episodes. We'll see how that goes. But today is all about key elements and diagnostic features. And so we're going to start first and foremost with the diagnostic features as it pertains to the Diagnostic Manual, which is right here in front of me, and I'm going to read through them. Now, I'm not going to just verbatim read through them. I'll try to extrapolate a little bit as we go. Recall, if you haven't seen my initial episode on reconceptualizing personality, I highly recommend to watch that before I go into this, because there's going to be certain things I'm building off of from that episode. I'll try to restate aspects of it. And one of the parts I'll restate right now is, remember, the Diagnostic Manual that I'm reading from right now is highly categorical, and it tends to focus on personality issues that, using psychodynamic language, are more in the mid-level of organization and below. So these are more pathological individuals. They're not really capturing the folks that aren't so pathological. And they also capture more of one subtype, which we'll get to in a future episode. So how the Diagnostic Manual works is they give us 9 criteria for alleged criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. Do note that these are well researched. That usually when we talk about diagnostic criteria, they're researching a bunch of symptoms to see what is truly prototypical. And this is important research, because if we have 50 criteria, it makes it really hard to narrow our focus on a condition, particularly personality disorder. So they've really distilled it down into these 9 key symptoms, and they say you need to have 5 of these 9 to diagnose. Again, as much as I'm not a huge fan of categorical models, this 5 of 9 marker, it's a little bit of a just gray line in the sand that they are drawing, but it's super important to do that because you're allowed to have aspects or elements of these symptoms and not qualify for their version, their marker for disordered or not. The other thing to bear in mind is that there's criteria beyond these 9, and the base criteria for personality is it has to be sufficiently pervasive, rigid, and inflexible over time, beginning earlier in development, usually the teenage years into the 20s, for it to qualify for a personality disorder. You don't typically see this randomly showing up at the age of 40. If it does, it's more of a defense matrix. Something has inflamed it, which you could argue means it was maybe always lurking beneath the surface a little bit more than not. And it's now become to a clinical level, or it's a temporary shift that you're not going to see longitudinally. So again, they have a good structure here. As much as I'm not a fan of categorical models, it's a pretty good structure. So without further ado, let's get into these 9. So the first one says a grandiose sense of self-importance. The examples, and again, these are just examples, they're not exhaustive, include an exaggeration of achievements and talents, expectations to be recognized as superior without commensurate achievements. Now, this is an interesting one, this last one about achievements, because sometimes they will have plenty of achievement to point to, particularly higher level of functioning. They can be quite savvy and thereby quite successful in the world. And so I think what this example is trying to get at is that they will be excessive in conveying their achievements and their desires for recognition and their sense of superiority, but it will still exist even in the absence of those achievements. And that's a really important point to make, is that this defense is so pervasive and almost even delusional in nature, which we'll get into in a future item here, that they will try to convince you, even when you look around saying, like, I don't see that on your resume. I mean, like, literal and figurative resume. Like, I'm not seeing it. Like, that's how pervasive the narcissistic defense can be. And this exaggeration of achievement and talents, it is this sort of outward expression of things, this grandiosity. It encompasses this grandiosity, which, to me feels very catty-corner to number 9. I'd be curious how the committees that define these 9 would differentiate between these two, because number 9 says they show arrogant, haughty, fun word, behaviors and attitudes, and they sound very similar. This sort of exaggeration and expectations for recognition are based in this sort of arrogance, this like, look at me, I'm larger than life. Grandiosity and arrogance, they're interesting constructs. I feel like they go hand in hand. It's hard to separate those two. But perhaps someone smarter than me can differentiate between those two. To me, they go very hand in hand. Number 2 is a preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. Now, what you're going to notice in a lot of these criteria, there's language that they use that's super important. For instance, on this one, a preoccupation, and then unlimited success, power, etc., etc. And what they're trying to do is differentiate between normal range and abnormal range. You and I can have fantasies. We're supposed to have fantasies. Our fantasy worlds are incredibly important to us. They're the seat of creativity. They're the seat of our needs and our values. They're a seat of our ability to think about ourselves and others without actually having to engage or encounter them. I mean, we need this part of ourselves. And with that part, we will often fantasize about success or what ifs and those sorts of things. I think it's often why people are quite fascinated with celebrity status. Not everybody, but it's a sort of vicarious fantasy of fame and success. I almost said shame and success. Fame and success. So we all have that, right? However, for narcissism, it is, what's the word they use? Preoccupations with this. And I think that the subtext of the preoccupation is that it's never enough. They will never be satiated. They are always fantasizing about something that could be better, something that ensures their sense of themselves, that firm, I am good, I am perfect. And then not only that, they're not modest fantasies. Unlimited, the word that they use. It's just this in excess. So there's excess, and that excess is also never enough. That is a huge component of their fantasy world. Number 3, they believe that they are special and unique and can be only understood by or should be associated with other special or high status people or institutions. Now, I really like that the Diagnostic Manual adds or institutions, because what it's trying to say and what is wise to think of in this respect is when they are looking for things that give them a sense of value, it's not just I am a great person and I'm going to associate with other great, people that I'm willing to esteem. It is also systems, occupations, like anything that they look to, there is something that is valued and there's something that is less valued. So it's not just people. It's not just people. I am special, and so I will associate with special activities, special systems, special positions, other special people. And this gets into valuing and devaluing, which we'll get into later in the psychodynamic realm. Number 4 is a very quick one, requires excessive admiration. Notice again the word excessive admiration. You and I need admiration. Admiration has a little bit of a tone to it. So let me re-rig this word. We all need recognition. I think we all need recognition in our lives. We are relational creatures. We want recognition from other people. But the narcissistic defense requires admiration and an excess of that admiration. It is what they need first and foremost. They are waiting with bated breath to ensure that admiration is acquired to some degree. And it once again comes back to this. It's almost like it's never enough. They get admiration. Well, that's all good and well. Maybe it holds them over for a week, but then they're looking for ongoing admiration. That excess is very important. Number 5 has a sense of entitlement. For example, or this is an example, how they describe it further, is unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with their expectations. So this entitlement is not just about, hey, I have healthy boundaries, I have healthy needs. Unreasonable. They are unreasonable to expect this out of other people. And it's that insatiability that I think is the latent word to me in a lot of these. But the unreasonable expectations of especially favorable or automatic compliance. So it's not just like, okay, that's generally favorable. No, I need it to the next level. Or this impatience with, like, I need this outcome right away. I can't wait and deal with the ambiguity of whether or not I'm kicking butt and taking names. I need to know I'm the best right away. And so they're not terribly patient with that. And there's this almost anxiety about attaining that. It might not come across as anxiety, but beneath the surface, there is a lot of anxiety to this. Number 6 and number 7 is interesting because now again, remember, it's 5 out of 9, so not everybody has these, but I think it speaks a little bit to subtypes, so there's context to these next ones, more context to these. The first one is interpersonally exploitative, so they exploit others, they take advantage of others to achieve their own ends. And this really runs the gamut, because on one end of the fence, I don't think it's like a conscious or as conscious, as malicious of a thing as it might sound at first. So think about this. The central dilemma here is one's own goodness. We're going to go into this more in the psychodynamic section, that I have to be perfect to be okay. Well, if that is the premium, if that's the most important aspect of their functioning, the most kind of relevant aspect of their defense, it becomes more about choice. So if they don't have to choose between themselves and somebody else, they can choose other people if those relationships behoove them. So they might be, or not behoove them, but if it benefits them. And so they can, for people in their inner circle, they're like, yeah, they're a pretty great individual. I don't mind them. They seem to give me a lot, which is because you're not threatening them. But if they are pushed into a choice between their sense of self and esteem or you, they're going to choose themselves. And that's, I think, a big piece of what we're talking about here, is that it's about the choice. It's not always overt. However, you can get far more, the word we'll use is malignant versions, where it becomes increasingly transactional, where it's not about an inner circle. Literally everybody is a tool to them. Everybody is a means to get to their end, the end result that they want. And so it happens on a continuum here. And so some of them aren't as overtly exploitative as they are just unreliable, I guess is a way to put it, and self-centered, versus some will absolutely exploit a bunch. And then there's the middle ground where they've got the inner circle, but then there's also tons of people they'll readily exploit because they're not valuable enough to them. They're not esteemed enough to be in this inner circle. So there's dimensionality to this. This goes into number 7, the lacking of empathy. Once again, it's kind of a curious one. How they expand upon this, they're unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. The word unwilling is important because in incapability, we're talking more in the realm of like antisocial psychopathy, which my opinion, there's a ton of misdiagnosis around antisocial. Some of it's more conduct related than it is truly a lack of empathy as being one of the qualifiers. However, you do have the true blue. They lack that activation. They lack that sort of empathic ability. And so we're talking about something different. For narcissism, it's like, well, I could technically empathize, but I'm not going to. Now, it's not necessarily a conscious thing. This is the power of their defense, is they're not going to admit to these internal pools. It's just the external, what's on the outside will be like a lack of empathy. But it's not that they're incapable. What the challenge is with empathy, especially if empathy has to deal with like empathizing with people or systems that might thereby reflect negatively on them, is that's too vulnerable for them. That puts them in a position for critique and not being perfect, because then they would have to rectify and or open themselves to feedback that they do not want, and thereby empathy is very dangerous to them. It's dangerous to the central defense, so they're not going to do it. However, when we go back to this idea of malignance, we'll talk more about this in the subtypes episode, is that there is some argument that they can lean heavier and heavier into just frank disregard for other human beings. I would say more of it's on that unwillingness and defensiveness around empathizing than it is truly, I don't really give a crap about anybody in the world. There is some room for that, but the majority of it, it's a defense around empathy than it is an incapability for empathy. Number 8, often envious of others and believe that others are envious of them. This one's interesting because the belief that others are envious of them, I think, is an easier argument. I think most people intuitively understand that. However, their envy of other people might not be so overt. You might hear them speaking highly of someone else or speaking highly of some sort of position, but they're not going to phrase it as envy more than likely, because envy implies weakness. But what they're pointing out, and I think is really important to understand, is that envy is a big component, and the psychodynamic folks talk a lot about this. And number 9, as we already went through, is the arrogance. So those are all 9. Those are all 9 for narcissism. They do a pretty good job. I don't complain overtly, as much as I don't like categorical models. These are relatively reasonable criteria, but as we'll go into in the subtype episode, it's a little bit of a narrow focus. So they're only focusing on a dominant aspect of narcissism, but it doesn't capture everybody, and I think that's where some of the rub is, and rightfully so. So what does psychodynamic theory offer? What additionally does it offer? The Diagnostic Manual also does talk about this underlying nature of insecurity. But the psychodynamic people, I love them. That's why I'm one of them. Is this sort of, that sounded narcissistic. I love them because I'm one of them. I mean, I love them because they speak in narratives, and that is why I am one of them. Oh, did I? And so they really give it a lot of color and shading depth, because underneath the surface, what psychodynamic people will talk about, there is something very hollow. There's something very empty with these individuals. The insecurity is the origin story for this, and it's the origin story for a lot of problems in our life. The narcissistic defense is simply one of them. But do not forget that while the symptoms are very external focused and speak a lot to what they do to their environment and what they are unwilling to do, beneath the surface is this insecurity. And the narcissistic defense defends this insecurity at all costs. The way I see it is, imagine that the insecurity is so pervasive or so heavy that it becomes a black hole, something that is untenable and unmanageable for them. So they have to defend it against it at all costs. So they create almost like this barrier. If you imagine this black hole, they construct this big, apparatus around this black hole to prevent anything from being sucked in. But this is where we get back to this idea of it almost being delusional in nature, if not overtly delusional in nature. Not like psychotic spectrum delusional, but delusional in its own right. Because if you were to ask them and challenge them that there's some sort of insecurity, that this black hole exists at the core, they will look in your face and say, I don't know what you're talking about. No, I'm not insecure. I feel pretty good about myself. Or some of the covert people might be like, well, yeah, there's certain things, but at the end of the day, I'm pretty kick-ass. And so it's fascinating that they not only create an infrastructure or a shell around this black hole, they will actively deny that the black hole exists. It is gone from their conscious awareness most of the time, which is just a really, I think, important thing to recognize with them, that beneath the surface, there is something very empty and hollow that you might start to detect, but they are unwilling to admit to. And this gets to this notion that I was talking about earlier, that one of the really pathological beliefs that they have about themselves is, I have to be perfect to be okay. I have to be rock solid to be okay. And anything less than perfection, anything less than high levels of esteem and satisfaction with myself, is incredibly dangerous to me. And how that comes about is almost like if you imagine scales shifting in reversed. So we've got this underlying insecurity. I am less than. There's something wrong with me. There's something inadequate about me. I am down here. And then this is where envy also comes into play. That there are places, people, systems, there's a future where I could be so much better than I am right now. And other people have these things and I do not. And I do not know how to get them in a healthy manner. This is not like conscious conversation. This is what's beneath the surface. And so what do? They take their lack of sense of self and insecurity and create a narcissistic defense that says, I am perfect. And then envy, it's what kind of feeds, like, I'm gonna attack these things and get to these things that I envy so that I can inhabit them. And now I am above everything else. So there's this switch between these scales of I am nothing and the world is great to I am everything and the world is either great with me or not so great. It's just the process of how the defense takes hold. Now, what they do to achieve this is, one, in many ways, they're very driven folks. Kudos to them in that regard. They're just highly destructive in the process, because how they achieve those goals usually tramples on people and systems. That's why they're so incredibly destructive. And they do this through valuing the things that give them worth. And that's easy enough. It was one of the criteria we went through. The destructive part is they then devalue things that challenge them or use the devaluing to make sure that they feel better and that they are perceived as in a position of superiority. So they tend to look to people and systems, as I said earlier, that give them a sense of worth and say, see, these other things that you seem to value, or I imagine you might value, I'm right here catty corner with them, which makes me pretty darn good, right? That's like, look at these things that I'm associated with. I'm amazing by virtue of being next to these amazing things. But what happens the minute someone challenges them? They are put into a devalued state and say, well, they wouldn't say I was wrong. These people are no longer worth anything. I've learned things about them that they were not good, or this system does not work for these reasons, and I'm going to try to convince you that they are garbage. They are garbage. Because if I am associated at all with something that is not good, that's not good for me. So I need to put distance right away. And they will do anything they can. They will trample on whatever, whenever. They will destroy whatever they need to preserve this sense of value and this need to be perfect. And that is that really challenging dynamic that people can feel. It's very, when they're very transparent, they're devaluing everything. Well, it's obvious. The really challenging ones is when do they choose, and how do they choose what they value to ensure that they look good. And a lot of people will value things that they associate with. That's not the tricky part. That is the tricky part, because I think what really makes it transparent when you're dealing with narcissism is how do they deal with criticism, how do they deal with the not so good stuff. Do they self-reflect? Do they take it in? Or do they devalue it? Do they spend all of their time devaluing it? That is a really key and critical part. Is one, they always seem to need to be perfect. And two, how do they do when they're challenged? Do they devalue or do they take it in? I think those are probably the easiest litmus tests for narcissism. We've got all these wonderful symptoms, all these ways of conceptualizing things, but at the end of the day, when you're talking about that shell around the hollow core, to me, those are really two big hallmarks of like, okay, we're dealing with something a little bit dicier here. So those are the diagnostic criteria, as well as some information from the psychodynamic folks. Remember, next time we're going into development and subtypes, treatment, and even intersections with society. But hopefully this has been a helpful start point to conceptualize how we at least move towards potential diagnosis with narcissism. And hopefully I'll see you in these future episodes. And also, as always, stay curious.